would like to introduce you to someone who is a part of the history of our global ministries, particularly in Russia. This is Robert Travis, and he is to be interviewed today and tell us about how the Russian ministries began way back when. So Robert, tell us first a little bit about yourself first, and how you came to Science of Mind, and then how you got yourself to Russia and Marion Parish Hall and all of that basic history that started taking us to Russia. But when was that? It was USSR at the time. But go ahead and begin, if you will.
Right. Yes, I was born in Long Beach, and from the time I was old enough infant to attend a Baptist church, my mother did the same as was done with her. I was going to the Baptist church in Long Beach from my earliest days until I was about 19 years old. And it's interesting that my Russian students would enjoy my story. The same question, how did I come to Science of Mind? It first involved leaving the Baptist church, and I was at Long Beach City College in a literature class reading Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and there was a dialogue there about the question of believing in God or not. And I was on the fence at that time, and it was that dialogue that helped me clarify what I was really feeling, and I walked away from the Baptist church due to a Russian author. And it was some years after that. I was an agnostic, and somebody gave me a book by Edgar Cayce, The Sleeping Prophet, and I read that, and I had to say, this can't be a hoax. There's got to be something out there, there's got to be like some medium where Edgar Cayce gets this information. There's something much bigger than us, like everywhere accessible and available. And then I started taking classes for the second time in college in Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And without really a keen interest in one field, I took many subjects and got A's in music, physics, social sciences, and I began to develop my own notion that the universe, because of this broad perspective, I began to feel the universe made sense, that everything was logical and ordered, and I saw that the things that were puzzles to us were being solved as we grew in our understanding as a people, as a race. And I understood that if I don't think something makes sense, it's because of my lack of scope, my lack of understanding, and that I could trust that because this is an ordered universe, that whatever it is makes sense. And so that was something I was really feeling deeply when somebody invited me to go to the Church of Religious Science in Durango, Colorado for the very first time. And as it turns out, the speaker at that church, the founder of that church, was Reverend Marlene Oakes.
Oh, uh-huh.
I didn't know it at the time because I saw her once. And then I had to go back to work we had tourist seasons in Durango. I had to go back to work on weekends. And by the time I went back to that church regularly the following off season, she had moved on, and there was a reverend, another minister there, Reverend Carl Stouffer, I believe.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm. I remember him.
Mm-hmm. And
so how did you get the call to go to Russia? You spoke the language, I take it, from college? No, you didn't?
No. Well, as it turned out, at the Church of Religious Science in Durango, I went to a meeting for a guy that was traveling around Colorado promoting the first World Healing Meditation in 1987. Mm-hmm. And he actually, it was called the World Institute of Cooperation that year. And as a part of the committee to promote this, and I was going to do it on the college radio station, I was handed these 2 cassette tapes from UNICEF. Hugh Downs was the moderator, and I remember the voice so well. But I was exposed in working with this material to the extraordinary number of people that I didn't have any idea. So many people were building bridges between societies or peoples whose oftentimes governments didn't have diplomatic relations, but people were working at a grassroots level. And between that and another tape called The Visions of a Possible Future, where visionaries of all sorts, scientists, religious leaders, were sharing why they were so excited about being alive today. And this caught my imagination, and I began to get the idea that I would like to do something along these lines. And with the #1 immature global relationship on the planet being USA, USSR, and all the childish banter back and forth in the headlines, sound familiar? I thought that would be something for me to think about, and stuff. It was about the time of that World Healing Meditation where we packed our sanctuary full that first year. I think it was at that occasion that I went to some friends of mine that did a lot of work with applied kinesiology and taught holistic health therapies. And I said, would you muscle test me to see if I should plan to go to the Soviet Union? And so my friend Randy Barnes, I put my arm out and he said, okay, hold the thought. He said, yes, that's strong. You should plan to go. And that was the beginning of my real intention.
Okay. And so then how did you get a connection to go and who to be with?
Well, with a great deal of difficulty, because somehow I managed to be raised to think that I wasn't good enough and I couldn't do it. So when I first went to California to network and find organizations that were doing things in the Soviet Union, nothing came together. And I began having these dreams repeatedly, and gradually I understood these dreams were saying that I believe I can't do it, I'm not good enough. So I right away called Monty Moore in Durango, because she taught gods and goddesses and dream journaling and healing the inner child. And I told her, I've got to do something quick. I got to come and take a class with you that's coming up soon. So I moved back to Durango and did a lot of deep work. And in the meantime, I have to say, in the meantime, now who would ever think that the Dodgers would enter into this? I went out to Florida to celebrate my 30th year as a Dodger fan. And in West Palm Beach, I was at Church of Religious Science, and talking to a guy about my vision of going to the Soviet Union. And he said that he had been to a conference in Washington, D.C. that was hosted by the Center for Soviet American Dialogue, headed by Rama Vernon. And he told me all about the peers coming from Russia to meet their American peers and find common grounds for dialogue and that's the type of thing that this leading citizen diplomacy outfit was doing in those years. I'm talking 1988. So I made a note, Soviet American New Thought initiatives. No, not that's Reverend Marion Parish Hall. This was Center for Soviet American Dialogue with an office in the Peace Committee in Moscow. And Rama Vernon was out of Bellevue, Washington. So I went up. I had a friend living near there, an old Air Force buddy, and I rode my motorcycle all the way to Washington, stayed with my friend, and did a couple of days of volunteer work in the office of Center for Soviet American Dialogue. And it was there in that office that I met a volunteer, Reverend B. Culver, religious science minister. So I got acquainted that way. Rama Vernon was in the Soviet Union, so I didn't get to meet her at the time. But I completed my work in Durango of kind of correcting these inner beliefs that were an obstacle. And I was about ready to come back to California when I encountered an article by Reverend Marion Parrish Hall, I think it was October 1990, about the study groups in the Soviet Union in Kyiv, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. So I was going to be going back to California soon, and I found out she and Reverend John T. Hall were in Yucaipa. And so I went back to California, swung by her place, left a note, and she left me a message by the time I got to home in Long Beach. And we visited, and things then came together very quickly. Rama Vernon needed somebody in the Center for Soviet American Dialogue because somebody came back to America and family affairs were going to hold them here. So I was interviewed in the home of Florin Harper in Laguna Hills. She was a practitioner for Peggy Bassett. And Rama Vernon selected me to fill this position in Moscow in the Soviet Peace Committee in their office. And as soon as she selected me, I said, well, I would like to use the facilities there, the fax and the computer and printer in my spare time for New Thought outreach. And she said, oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, when I was a little girl, I think it was, she said, Reverend Frederick Bales, an early religious science teacher from the 40s and 50s. She said, he used to come by our house after church, and yeah, I'm familiar with religious science and would be really happy for you. You're absolutely welcome to use those facilities. So I called Reverend Marion Parrish Hall and said, I'm going to Moscow in 30 days and I have an office for us to use. And she was delighted, called a special board meeting and had me appointed co-director of the outreach of Soviet American New Thought Initiatives outreach in Moscow.
Okay, is that Santi?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Santi is Soviet American
New Thought Initiative.
Interesting. Okay, do you know how long Marion Parrish Hall had been going to Russia before you joined with her?
I don't know. I don't know how many times. I think she went with Peggy Bassett, perhaps, and Patch Adams back in '87. I'm not sure about that. And then maybe a follow-up, but I know that she had traveled to Kyiv and St. Petersburg and spoken to, and established study groups. And those were study group leaders that eventually came here and studied in the United States. But no, I don't know that much about her history, how many times she had gone.
Okay, I'm just curious. You said she had groups in 3 cities, I think you said, didn't you? St. Petersburg and
St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kyiv.
Uh-huh. So there were study groups started then, and that she had started.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so you were in Moscow then, is that right?
I arrived there on May 1st, 1991.
Mm-hmm. And
I had been charged with Reverend Marion Parrish Hall, by Marion Parrish Hall, to start work on a New Thought conference in October in St. Petersburg. Okay. It would be the first New Thought conference. And we're using the broader term New Thought because there were Unity and religious science ministers had put this New Thought organization together.
So that was a New Thought conference, and it was, when did that take place?
Well, it took place in October, but how can I put it? I was alarmed to find that I couldn't reach any of these study groups. And the reason was I arrived on May 1st, and these people suspended their study groups for the summer because the participants pretty much had to go out and plant their gardens at their dachas, because this is how Soviet people made it through the winter, was growing gardens at their dachas and putting things up, pickling them, drying them, whatever. So they had enough sustenance for the long winters.
Wow,
And
interesting.
so I arrived there, and there's no study groups happening, and I'm supposed to get a new thought conference going.
Mhm.
Get the plans laid, and there was nobody to really get on board with me. And although it was interesting, there was two contacts in Moscow. One of them was my co-director, Alisa Shabrova. So first night in Moscow, I called her up, and she starts telling me, the groups in St. Petersburg and Kiev won't cooperate with me. They won't talk to me, and I can't communicate with Marian Parish Hall. And when she got done with all these details, she started over and repeated them. And about the third or fourth time, I found myself wondering if this lady ever takes a breath. Because I'm trying to say, well, that's over now. We're in touch. That's going to end, and this is a new beginning. Communication is facilitated, and so the next night I called her, and she started going over the same thing, and so it was very crazy trying to communicate with Alisa Shabrova, and part of that is her consciousness was a complete turnaround from anything we were interested in. Turns out Alisa Shabrova was KGB.
Oh.
And the real contact person in Moscow was Ina Cohn. And she was very helpful and very interested in our work, and she knew Marian Parish Hall. So Ina Cohn was a big help to me. She was my right-hand person in Moscow, helping me as we started making plans for the conference. But there was a very unforeseen development that was magnificent in bringing this conference about. Rama Vernon, with this office in the Soviet Peace Committee, Rama Vernon had been a yoga teacher for decades. And so according to that, she attracted attention from yoga people in Moscow as she went about her business there. And there were two people that in Rama Vernon's absence, and while I was there in the Soviet Peace Committee working in the office, two wonderful ladies came in to get acquainted, and they were Galina Molodtsova, a Reiki master. I didn't know it at the time, but she traveled and taught Reiki. And one of Moscow's leading healers, Evelina Zhdanova. These two ladies were practitioners of Agni Yoga, and that's why they were very connected to the office in Rama Vernon and wondering when she was coming back, but they asked me about what I was doing there. And I shared with them about Science of Mind, and they had a grandmother's group that they met with, I think it was weekly, in a Sobyes, which is, that's Russian, and it's pretty much a senior citizen service center. Okay. And they had a grandmother's group, and they invited me to come speak to their group. And so I began doing that, and they really liked what I was presenting. Now, it was interesting at this time. I had only completed Science of Mind 1 and 2. And my intention in Moscow was to simply sit in and join the study group. Well, when I got there wasn't one going on. But I got one through Evelina and Galina, and at the Senior Citizen Center. And so that was my first group, and we had no literature, nothing written. Everything they had in Russian was what they wrote down from the translated notes, and Galina was my interpreter. And so this was the beginning. Now, Galina, Evelina Zhdanova had been featured numerous times in a Soviet Union-wide journal or magazine. They call them journals, and it was called Inward Path, and Put k Себе, Inward Path. Well, they asked if I would like to be interviewed. This was like in August. I actually have in my computer photo scanned copies of that interview, of me being interviewed and how that resulted. But it was in Inner Path magazine. I was interviewed and about Science of Mind. And so they put in a little bit of information about the upcoming New Thought Conference in St. Petersburg. And this is the means by which we had roughly 200 people from 7 republics show up in St. Petersburg for our New Thought Conference in October.
Wow. That was 1991, huh?
That October of 91, yes. So it was like
Wow.
6 months after I got there.
That's great. Okay, so then did Marion Parrish Hall then come to that? And is that how you got acquainted with her and all, or what?
Well, I had met her once in the United States, and we had spoken a number of times on the phone. She was very excited to have an actual office support in Moscow, and email communication was very difficult in those days. But I could go up to the 6th floor of the Peace Committee and dial I think it was 8 over and over and over until I finally got a line out, and then send a fax. There was no email, actually. Marion and I were faxing back and forth.
Okay.
And so we were communicating, and she came. I regret that I can't remember a lot of the people that came in that first group. My records used to be in a what was it, a Hotmail account I had. And when I went to Yahoo and didn't do any action on my Hotmail account, all of a sudden I was shocked to find that all my records, back and forth emails that revealed so much and had a history of what was going on, all of a sudden that didn't exist anymore because they deleted it from inactivity, and I lost a great deal.
Okay, so let's move forward. And when Shirley Morgan and Bob Grabowski and Sherry Brent and all of these people began coming over there and teaching classes and visiting and doing whatever it was what they started doing, and groups started being developed. So was that soon after that conference? Is that when that started happening?
Well, Svetlana Tabachnikova in Kyiv, after the summer, began to have her group meet again. But of course, shortly thereafter, she was present there in St. Petersburg. And of course, so was Ludmila Androsova, the study group leader in St. Petersburg, and a few people from Moscow. But well before that conference, Shirley Morgan, she was a member of the Mile High Church in Denver, and she was a Delta Airlines flight attendant. And they began service in Moscow 2 or 3 months after I arrived there. And so as soon as she got into Moscow, I get a phone call from her. And we became close friends, and I showed her around Moscow, and she became a great avenue because sending things back and forth was impossible. She shuttled mail, communiques, money, and became a very an important conduit, made things very simple. And it was not long before...
Travis, for the audience, she was an airline attendant.
Flight attendant, yes.
Flight attendant. And so she had a way to get and travel to and from Russia frequently, for USSR at the time.
She was coming every week to 10 days. It was a staggered schedule with long layovers, 4 to 6 days. They weren't flying that often. So she would be in Moscow for 4 to 6 days every time she came. And so she got to come and meet my group, and then she and a lady, Renata Rash, who was also another that worked as for me, I'm talking about the need that with the inflation that Russian people were finding it very difficult to eat well. And so they came up with this idea of if Americans would pledge $10 a month, that Shirley would take the money and actually put it in the hands of the people that signed up to be assisted in this fashion. And Marlene Oakes was promoting this in her church and gathering donations and getting that money to Shirley Morgan. And so, I mean, in those days, a loaf of bread was like a third of a cent. $10 was an enormous help to families over there. And so this was a family of family thing that was happening that was beautiful and very effective, much more effective than a lot of outreach assistance.
Okay.
So Shirley became very much a part of the scene. She was at, I believe she was at the conference along with Reverend Marion Parrish Hall and Reverend Marlene Oakes, Reverend Ron Skeen, who was the vice president of Santee until that conference. The leadership changed at that conference in October.
Oh, okay. Is that when Marion Parrish Hall stepped down then and Marlene Oakes became the president or however the leader of it? Or
Well, I knew there was a board meeting going on, and this board meeting resulted in Marlene Oakes being voted in as the new president of Santee, which was a huge surprise to me because Reverend Marion Parrish Hall was the founder, and I had no idea this could happen. And Reverend Marion Parrish Hall had a big heart, but she and Ron Skeen were both saying yes to people's ideas of having a conference here and there, and without thinking about the difficult logistics this might involve. And Marlene Oakes was much more realistic in her approach to, weighing these things before just letting the heart say yes to so many ideas. And so I think that it was a very good move as far as the real functionality of Santee as an organization. But it was difficult. It seemed very difficult over the years. I understood that was difficult.
let me ask you something. How did these people get trained to have these centers? And I don't know their names. A couple of Galenas, I believe, and they're different people. How did they get their training to teach science of mind and expand science of mind over there?
Great question. Yeah, those early days were pretty crazy. There was a lot of interest, especially after that Inward Path magazine, interest in many cities. As translated material became available, I mean, these people just didn't have any training, really. They only had what they heard from our conference and other gatherings, and they did what they could with the understanding that they had. And we have blown past one thing that in the history that really needs to be highlighted. It was, I think, August 19th, a Monday, when the emergency committee seized power and arrested Gorbachev. And it was on that very day that a Santee delegation was flying from Helsinki to Moscow because the following Sunday was going to be the first official unity service.
Oh my goodness.
Church in Moscow.
Wow.
We don't want to blow past that. So to put things in chronological order, this delegation, I met them as soon as they arrived in town, and it turned out that when they got news in Helsinki about the coup, they ended up flying on an aircraft that was almost empty except for them, but they had faith and they believed in what they were doing and they knew it was going to work out. They were here for the first unity service. And it was a minister named Mikhail Zykov, the presiding minister, he was not formally trained, but it had some kind of, he was designated acting minister while his daughter was going to school in Unity Village. And Mikhail Zykov had translated the peace song. And so we had a conference call that following Sunday. By the way, the coup only lasted 3 days. By Wednesday, one had committed suicide and the others, anyway, they gave up. And Yeltsin had stood up to them at the White House. I actually was, on Monday, was in the dining room at the Minsk Hotel on Gorky Street when I heard a rumbling in the street, and I went and looked out the curtains, and the tanks were rolling down the street to go to the White House to arrest Yeltsin. But the people stood up, a sufficient number of people, while the masses were dejected like they'd lost their closest friend and were walking around in a stupor. A tiny fraction of the people stood up and said, no, we're not going back. Sufficient number to stand up to the tanks. So that all went very well due to some people who were courageous and stood by their convictions. And so things were back in order by the time we had the first Unity service on Sunday, with a conference call set up in the United States where those of us that were Americans sang the peace song, and then the Russians sang the peace song in Russian. And it was witnessed by several churches that were on this conference call. So that was really one of the great events of the early, of like 3.5 months into my stay there.
So it was 1991 then?
Yeah, I was in August of 1991, the first Unity service. And it gave me the idea. I started having other songs with which I was familiar translated into Russian, like Take a Little Love and Pass It On, and some other songs. And I started circulating these, and Marion Paris Hall's publication, The Healing Coin, that was the first thing we had published. And we published it for a nickel a copy. So as material got translated, I started circulating it to the outlying groups so they had something for reference, to help them do presentations. And training only transpired in that first year as people managed to come to get-togethers and the Americans only came, other Americans other than myself. There was Ron Skeen came and met with people and started doing workshops. And then we had the conference in October. The interesting thing that happened in October was there was a group of 7 people from the city of Izhevsk, about 700 miles east of Moscow, near the Ural Mountains. They were very inspired and excited about Science of Mind, mostly from their meetings with Reverend John Bradford from what I considered my home church, Guidance Church of Religious Science, Reverend Dr. Daniel Morgan. Mm-hmm. Reverend John Bradford and his wife were in St. Petersburg, and he really set these people from Izhevsk on fire in the meetings they had. And so they invited me to come speak in December. And they arranged for me to be interviewed on the radio, in the newspaper. I did 4 presentations in 3 days. And again, I had only had Science of Mind 1 and 2.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It was. The growth was enormous that I was going through, calling upon only me because I was the only one there. I had to do it. And so they actually had me come to an institute on a Friday night in Izhevsk to do a presentation in an auditorium. This auditorium, when they opened the door, there was standing room only, maybe 125 people in this Institute of Higher Learning. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've never spoken to that many people before. And I said to Galina Molotsova, just a minute. And we stepped back and I closed the door. And This looks like a major undertaking, but this is nothing to the Father and I. The Father and I can do this, and I got centered in that reality and walked in there, and things flowed out that I'd never thought of saying before. It was a magnificent experience, and Izhevsk ended up being the place where Reverend Ron Rood set up shop and taught and trained practitioners and even ministers. That's further down the line from where we're at.
Okay. So then, well, when was Reverend Ron Rood? When did he begin and get a center started there?
Okay. Well, prior to that, the following summer, we had another conference in Moscow.
Okay.
We had a lot of translated material from the textbook because we had our friends from Theodosia that worked extensively with Reverend Ron Skeen thereafter. But Anya Tsimchuk was working to translate the textbook. And I appointed her certain parts of the textbook we needed that were part of the foundational course. And as she translated this material, we had extensive number of pages. I don't know, something like 50 or 60 pages. And we needed to make like 100 and some copies.
And who was this that was translating?
From Theodosia, Anya Tsimchuk.
Okay, well, all right, fine.
and her partner was Valery Makartsev, who had been a Ukrainian Orthodox monk for 8 years. They ended up teaching Science of Mind in the public schools in Theodosia, in Crimea, for years. But anyway, she provided a lot of material for our conference in Moscow in July of 1992. And it was shortly after that I returned to the United States with Svetlana Tabachnikova from the study group leader from St. Petersburg, Ludmila Androsova from, Svetlana was from Kiev. Ludmila Androsova came and was hosted by Peggy Bass's church along with her daughter Vasilisa. Galina Malasova and Evelina Zhdanova came and were hosted in Fullerton by Reverend Marion Parish Hall. Svetlana was hosted by the Seal Beach Church. And so I facilitated them getting their visas, and we got back to the United States just in time to travel up to Asilomar, where there was that big event where they were all presented at Asilomar as study group leaders. And it was that summer when I met Reverend Ron Rood at the Seal Beach Church, where he was doing an internship, and he shared with me his interest in going to Moscow and working, traveling and doing lectures and workshops, and so that was in the summer of the late summer or fall of 1992 that I got acquainted with Reverend Ron Rood.
All right. And Ron Skeen, how and when did he get involved?
Well, he was, when I met Marion Parish Hall and when I contacted Santi, Ron Skeen was already the vice president.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
So he predated me, and he actually came and visited Moscow 1 month after, or a month and a half or so after I had arrived. Now, a very interesting thing happened. This is quite a story. Reverend Ron Skeen was flying in. Marion Parish Hall sent me a fax asking me to meet him at the airport. I assured her that I would. And as I talked to Elisa Shabrova, Ron had been talking with her on the phone, and she said, "Oh, you don't need to go. I'm meeting him at the airport." And I say, "Well, that's very fine, but I think I should follow through because Reverend Marion Parish Hall is under the understanding that I will meet him at the airport so we can go together. Well, she gave me all these reasons why that would be difficult to meet and go to the airport. And as it turned out, she shoved off and went without me. And she used those 3 days. I didn't see Ron for 3 days. And true to form, to tried and true KGB agent, in those 3 days, she served him tea and biscuits and crumpets and was the perfect hostess. And apparently, unknown to me, told him all these stories about how horrible I was to her. So that when I finally met them on Gorky Street, I walked up and Ron Skeen said to me, "Travis, I don't even want to talk to you." Which was alarming to me because I thought my position there was in jeopardy with the vice president saying that. So I went right away and typed out a page about what had happened and what Alyssa Shabrova had done, and sent it off to Marion Parish Hall. And she got a fax back to me telling me, don't worry about it. I only appointed Ron Skeen vice president so he'd get more involved. And she told me that don't be concerned, your position is safe. I understand. And the bizarre thing is that when Marlene Oakes took over in October, she came down to me and she said, "Travis, I don't really know Ron Skeen. I would like you to do something for me. Would you inform Reverend Ron Skeen that he's no longer should be presenting himself as being able to speak for Santee?"
Okay. So then shortly after this, is that when you left Moscow for a time and came back to the U.S.?
Yes, but in preparation for that, there was a couple of things that happened for the operation as it was at the time. There was a lady named Tanya from the city of Tambov, and she offered to handle book sales. We started having some literature available, and what I did was there were all these outlying cities where people wanted material. So I set it up where she could extend a certain amount of credit, which in a dollar amount wasn't very much. So she could mail books to people that we had, mail literature to anybody that was interested, and they had a little bit of credit, because everybody always knows someone coming to Moscow that can come and bring money and pay for their books and have their credit. But so Tanya was gracious and wonderful in handling that, so that when I left, literature would still be available. The other thing that happened is that a practitioner named Terry Christensen arrived in Moscow just before I left, and I handed all the materials and the contact numbers and the operation over to Terry Christensen to handle things and to continue the work while I was in the United States. And then so I came to the United States about the 31st of July with the ladies that I mentioned that came to Asilomar in August of 91. So then I'm back in the United States. Terry Christensen's in charge in Moscow of the work, and it's no longer the Soviet Union, but in it happened before the conference. It went from Soviet Union to the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. Leningrad became St. Petersburg, and while we were planning the conference, so a lot of things happened in that first 15 months, and then I returned after 15 months of being immersed in this work. Another thing that happened is a Peace Pilgrim organization reached out to me. They needed somebody to facilitate translation and publication of Steps by Peace Pilgrim, that publication that they provide free of charge and that they fund by donations. So I had money for a publishing Peace Program, and I handled that while I was there. So it was So a lot transpired that 15 months.
So could you speak Russian fluently then by that time, or pretty
Well,
fluent?
I knew 100 words before I went to Russia. I had checked out a book from the library and practiced writing the alphabet. And I knew the alphabet very well, so I could read the signs in the metros,
Mhm.
and I was able. Uh, I was able on my first day in Russia, of course, May 1st. That's it. That's the biggest holiday they've got. So our office was closed, and I was able to use the Russian as I understood it to find the university in Russia. And one of my favorite stories is I was pitching batting practice to the #1 team in the Soviet Union within 24 hours after arriving. So I had that functional of a understanding of Russia to be able to find my way around. But by the end of 15 months, my Russian was very elementary. It wasn't until it was at that conference and just before that conference that I met the lady that would be my Ukrainian wife, and she spoke no Russian. So it was in. I mean, she spoke no English, so we conversed in Russian, and that really accelerated. But my Russian was very poor after 15 months. In spite of having it had advanced quite a bit because I made flashcards of everything I wanted to say and couldn't. And so I studied these flashcards when I was on the metro, and then I would, of course, have immediate use for those words. So I advanced rapidly, but it was still very elementary after 15 months.
Did you get married before you came back to the U.S.?
No, actually, it was after my next stay. uh, I came back after almost a year in the United States. I went back and I actually went and lived with my future wife in Donetsk. And then it was after that that she came to America and we got married in Colorado.
Oh, okay.
But the other workers that came, like Terry Christensen, like Barbara Leger, like Ron Root, all got involved with interpreters. So because I was involved with somebody that spoke English, I far outdistanced them because I spoke Russian. I had to speak Russian at home. And it was the accelerated course over time. Um, so, yeah, I was in America, met Ron Rood, and I'm trying to remember, I think he didn't come back until the following, I was back before he was actually. I
Back
was
in Russia?
back in Russia because I came back while the conference was going on. They had another Moscow conference in the summer of '93, and I arrived while that was going on.
Mm.
Martin Oakes and Santee had the second New Thought conference in Moscow in summer of '93. And I arrived, attended that for a couple of days, and then I moved to Donetsk, Ukraine, to live with Nila Nosova. And so started doing the outreach ministry in Donetsk. And during that year that I was in the United States, I took Practitioner 1 course.
That's great.
First time I went to, I actually arrived in the Soviet Union, and 15 months later departed departed Russia as an independent country in the Commonwealth of Independent States. So it was a big transition, and transition was a lot for Russians to get accustomed to because they had been calling St. Petersburg Leningrad their whole lives, and our first New Thought conference was in St. Petersburg. And because I was fresh and new to the scene, it was easy for me to remember St. Petersburg and remind people when they were using the term Leningrad. But one thing that I skipped as I discussed that first 15 months was a rather extraordinary process of beginning work on translating the whole Science of Mind textbook. We didn't have the budget like they had for top-selling novels where there was translator teams at publishing houses to do the work. We had a budget, a restricting budget as our outreach ministry was at the time. And so I accumulated a number of interested parties, 7 people that were interested in translating our book. So I took some of the initial pages of the textbook and gave it to 7 candidates to translate to see who we would select. And then they gave me back their work, and I went to other really qualified English-speaking people that were not interested in doing that work to have them evaluate the work and select. And we selected a team from the nearby community of Troitsk outside of Moscow, and we and they began work. They translated the textbook for us, and I began to understand right away why there's so many misconceptions that come out of the many translations of the Bible, because in one translation I was getting things that were off the mark, and I saw what a substantial undertaking that is to have serious works translated into another language. And so we ended up some months later with 2 almost phone book sized booklets, part 1 and part 2 of the textbook, and but it was a big step that we had the Science Mind textbook available in Russian.
Is this a 1938 edition of the textbook?
I think you're referring to the 1928 edition. Yes, the more common one. Yes.
The newer one. Yes.
Yeah, the first one, the original was 1926, and but most of us used the 1928, the one that was revamped.
Okay,
Yes.
1938. I want to tell you that we do not have a copy of that in the archives, and if you have a copy that you would volunteer to give it to the archives, it would be highly appreciated. Okay, I just want you to know that, just as an offside.
I know I have a copy. I would hope that I have more than one, because there may be some use to be made out of a copy of that, in that I've been told by very, very credible sources that while there were inaccuracies in that original publication, the Russian language was a higher level than the actual book we have in use right now. And I'd like to follow up and get other opinions, because it seems to me that's something that people deserve. I don't know what could be done, but yeah, I will undertake to see if I have a copy.
Okay. There's always that in every translation, whether it's Spanish or what it is. If the people, if they're not from the same region and the same dialects, there's always confusion or whatever about the different translations. So
really, it's a little bit tenuous to get general consensus, all around consensus. What is the better work? Yeah.
Okay, that's great. All right, so from there, go ahead with your story. I'm sorry.
Well, when last we left off, I believe that we had the second conference in the summer of '92, just prior to me departing from Russia to come back to the United States. We had the conference in Moscow, and we had, of course, a lot of people coming that had been at the conference in St. Petersburg, and it was actually held at the Olympic Village on the outskirts of Moscow. That was the Olympic Village of the 1984 Olympics that the United States boycotted. And that's where we had our conference, and housed all the students, and had nice housing for for the teaching team. I think there was 7 or 8 of us that were from the United States, including Terry Christensen, who would take over directing things as I departed, and she was a practitioner. Also, there was Reverend Marlene Oakes and her husband Gil, and there was very notably Diane Borsikovsky, because one of the most notable things that happened was when we needed a break, Diane Borsikovsky had all 200 people or 170 or whatever it was come outdoors, and through her interpreter, she ran everybody through the hokey pokey in a big circle. And the Russians were very impressed by that, because always their religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, is a very serious undertaking in it. This is not a time for levity and outward displays of joy, certainly inward displays of joy through contemplating roses or gardens. But this was something that was like incongruent in their minds, that they thought that was very interesting when we go out and play and have so much fun at a spiritual conference. And so it was a great move by Diane Borsikovsky, because many Russians told me that really like kind of completed their picture of what this was about.
Okay, that's great.
So then when I came back to the United States, I had undertaken to go to the embassy and do the work to get the visas in order for Ludmila Androsova and her daughter Vasilisa in St. Petersburg, who were hosted eventually by the Huntington Beach Church and Peggy Bassett. And then my interpreter, Galina Molitsova, a Reiki master who traveled a lot in former Soviet Union, and her close friend Evelina Zhdanova, a very respected healer in Moscow, both Agni Yoga enthusiasts. They were hosted by Marlene Oakes' church in Fullerton. So they were in the entourage that came back with me from to the United States, along with Svetlana Tabachnikova, hosted by the Seal Beach Church, who was had the group in Kyiv. So we all came back and we all went to Asilomar, where 10-year-old Vasilisa Androsova was a precious presentation on the stage at Asilomar, because she spoke 4 languages at the age of 10, and was a very impressive young lady. So, and then I spent a year in Russia, almost a year, before I returned in the summer of '93, and I returned while the conference was just getting started, the 3rd conference, New Thought Conference, again in Moscow. And I believe by that time, Reverend Duffy Rutledge had arrived, either that or shortly thereafter, because I met Duffy when I came back to Russia. And she took over things because she was a minister. She took over things, directing the outreach ministry over there from our practitioner, Terry Christensen. And Duffy Rutledge was quite a dynamic and impressive presence. She was real firecracker and accomplished great things during her time there. And I would hope we can Google her name and or by some means find her. You need her story, because experiences like, you know what happened during that time when the Soviet Union first fell and we had all these independent states. I was able to travel to Ukraine, travel to Belarus or whatever, Latvia, and there were not passport control and customs stations set up yet as you cross the borders. But as they managed to get these things going, it became very ambiguous in traveling. And one thing that happened to Duffy, Reverend Duffy Rutledge, was that she got an invitation to go speak. I believe it was in Estonia. It could have been Latvia, but she met some people there, and she was the first woman to speak behind the pulpit at this church. And she was due to come join me and Reverend Ron Rood in November, as I had promoted a 3-day workshop in Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, where I was living. And we were going to have a 3-day conference featuring myself, Reverend Duffy Rutledge, and Reverend Ron Rood. And Reverend Duffy called me from, it might have been Estonia, to tell me that unfortunately she didn't have a visa to get back to Russia because it just was not clear. You could leave one country and not be able to get back without knowing ahead of time. So I've run a little bit ahead chronologically, because before I went to before that conference, a little bit before that, I think Reverend Ron Rood arrived in Moscow, and I went to Moscow to get acquainted. Well, I met him in Seal Beach the previous summer. So I went to Moscow to, have further meetings to tell him about the work that was going on and about some of the cities he might visit. It was very amusing scenario that played out, because Reverend Ron Rood assured me that as he traveled to these different cities, what he was wanting to do was outreach ministry in the form of doing introductory lectures and workshops and bring Science of Mind to several locations. And he wasn't going to accept an invitation to stay in one place and live there and start the work, in one place. He wanted to travel around. And also I talked with him about the upcoming conference and in Donetsk, because when I returned to Russia after that conference in Moscow, I moved to Donetsk to live with my fiance. Well, not fiance at the time, but my future wife. And that's in eastern Ukraine, where we've seen that starting a couple of years ago so much in the news with the Russian separatists. So that Donetsk region is very familiar to me. And so what came to pass was Reverend Duffy called me and said she was stuck in Estonia and she apologized she couldn't come. I called Reverend Ron Rood and told him it was just he and I. He was still in Moscow. And he said, well, it sounds like it's all falling apart. I don't think I'm going to come.
Oh, dear.
And so I've got these posters around town that there are 3 of us. And I ended up doing that 3-day workshop that weekend. And it went well, but it was quite the rigorous undertaking, and it did go well. And we had some people from Crimea come up and join us that had become very familiar with Science of Mind, because Valery Makartsev, who had been a Ukrainian Orthodox monk for 8 years, came up and he spelled me, because it was his partner, Anya Tasinchuk, that did the translation work previously. And so he was very familiar with that material, and they had already begun teaching Science of Mind in the public schools there in Crimea. So he was somebody that he was predisposed to really understanding the core of what we were teaching. And so it was very helpful to have him there to give me a break and talk to the people and even answer questions, and a trusted person to do that. A little bit later, I found out that Ron Rood had gone to visit Izhevsk. I think I remember in part 1 of this interview, I told you that 7 people from Izhevsk were in St. Petersburg at the conference and very much fired up about Science of Mind, and invited me to come do some lectures in Izhevsk. Now, this is 700 miles, almost directly east of Moscow, almost to the Ural Mountains. And Izhevsk is the capital of Udmurtia, and it's a city of about 500,000 people. Well, those people so leaned upon Reverend Ron Rood to start a Science of Mind school there that right away he decided to settle down there and tap into that enthusiasm and get classes going. And that's where the first Russian practitioners were trained, schooled, trained, and had their oral panels at the oral conferences in subsequent years. So Izhevsk was a major presence, location for Science of Mind work. I mean, other religions, other people would come, and it would be St. Petersburg, Moscow. Not us. We were in Izhevsk, which is a great place. I've been there many times. It's wonderful.
Okay. So this was what? Are we in 1995 now?
No, I was in Donetsk from 1993 to 1994, and I was teaching classes. We still didn't have the foundational course translated. Reverend Ron Rood was working on that in Izhevsk. And so I was doing classes in much the same fashion that I had in Moscow when I had absolutely no translated material. And then it was in Donetsk that I had a translation of the Fundamental Principles of Science of Mind by Frederick Bales translated and published. And so then I while I was in Donetsk for that 1 year, I got that book available for my students to have. And I also traveled to Sochi because it was Long Beach's sister city. That's where I was from. I went to Sochi. I got some contacts, and I set the stage for work in Sochi. I went there and managed to contact some people and do a lecture there on Science of Mind and do the groundwork. Eventually, I would move there a couple years. I moved there in 2000, 2001, or actually, I think 1999. So I traveled to Nalchik. We had a study group there, which is in the Caucasus Mountains, not far from Chechnya. And yeah, so I
So
go
let me
ahead.
ask Travis, during this time, were you still working for this this peace organization that you went over there originally for?
Peace Pilgrim?
The organization that you went originally to Moscow to be a part of.
Oh, no, that's right. Yeah, I skipped that. After about 9 months, I think it was, Rama Vernon, the founder and director of the Center for Soviet American Dialogue, had perestroika happened. The Soviet Union broke up. Rama Vernon's interests were going more into women's rights around the world, and she considered her work at the Soviet Peace Committee in Moscow done, and that office closed. So for my last 6 months in Moscow, it was necessary for me to find another sponsor to support my visa to be in Moscow, and for me to find my own residence. And I did move into a flat in Moscow. At the time, I was paying $50 a month, so my last 6 months in Moscow was after the Center for Soviet American Dialogue experience was over, which had provided us with an office and so on. And so that was in the past already. And so I was strictly working with Soviet American New Thought initiatives. Originally, New Thought in general, primarily unity and religious science. But as time went by, it like my second year or second trip there when I was in Donetsk, it was pretty much becoming a UCRS operation,
Okay.
because we were translating primarily. I mean, really, religious science had the most comprehensive curriculum available to present to Russians, and so it shifted with Reverend Duffy Rutledge there, and then Reverend Ron Rood. It really became a UCRS operation.
Okay. So Travis, so then you started having teaching and practitioners available, and they were in different cities around Russia and Ukraine. Are those the only two? What do they call? Are they called states of the?
Yeah, independent states. Yeah, the Commonwealth of Independent States. Yeah, or independent republics.
And where are those centers now? How many do you think there are now that still teaching science of mind?
I've rather lost touch. I left in 2002 after spending 6 out of 11 years. I spent 6 out of 11 years from 1991 to 2002 over there. But elderly parents, such considerations brought me back in 2002. But in the meantime, Reverend Ron Skeen, who was in the original Santi organization, became a legal resident of Ukraine, and he lived full-time in Feodosia and worked a lot with the people who were in Sevastopol and in Feodosia and Simferopol. Sevastopol is where the Russian Black Sea Fleet was. In 2000, I think it was 2000, I had planned an unusual conference tour. In previous years, we had stayed in Russia. For instance, Marlene Oaks would come to the group, Reverend Jules Jones, Ron Skeen would be there, and a number of other regulars for the annual conferences we did would come, and we would be in St. Petersburg, Moscow, maybe Kyiv. We'd go to Ufa. Izhevsk was covered because they had Reverend Ron Rood there. But I finally decided it was time for the Black Sea region to have a conference tour. And so in 2000, I planned the Black Sea tour for a number of people. We had a number of practitioners from Denver, and we went to Sochi, and that was the first time Sochi people, who I'd had students for a couple years that went through 3 or 4 courses. I taught foundational course, treatment and meditation at the time, and then Edinburgh lectures and self-mastery in Sochi. But they only knew me. And so when we had this conference in Sochi, we had other American ministers, and we even had some guest students from Izhevsk come down. And it was very interesting to have my students present with many other teaching styles and teaching, people with different backgrounds come. And then we went from there to Feodosia, and we had a weekend conference there. There was 3 consecutive weekend conferences, and then we went to the Black Sea port, where they had the Black Sea Russian fleet, Sevastopol. And right outside of town there is like 5th century Greek ruins. And so it was
What year was this?
This was in 2000.
2000.
Yes.
Okay, thank
And
you.
Barbara Leger joined us, and I'm looking forward to you having an interview. I don't know when she really settled into Cherkasy and became involved in Science of Mind outreach for Ukraine, and but we had things well established in Crimea for her and she would make regular trips there. That's all been changed since Russia took control of Crimea, and so that Barbara would need a visa to go to Ukraine, and maybe that's not in her jurisdiction now, but that's something to be revealed in your interviews with her.
Yes. And she does have, for your information, she does have practitioners there, and I believe they were relicensed. Yes, and I have interviewed Barbara, and
okay.
yes, so that's great. So when did you leave Russia for the last time, or that area for the last time?
Well, in 95, somewhere in 95, I went back to America. And then when I came again, I went to, a year later, I went to Sochi. In 2 trips, I spent a couple of years in Sochi. And then in 2002, in the summer of 2002, I went to the annual conference in Izhevsk as part of my farewell tour, because I was moving permanently back to Long Beach, California.
So that's 16 years ago. 16 years ago was the last time you were there?
Yes.
Oh.
No, since then I did go to, in 2008, I went to the annual conference in Izhevsk.
Oh, okay.
And worked with Reverend Kathy Hearn and a number of people. Actually, she was there. Yeah, she was there at that time, and with a number of practitioners from San Diego. And I also went to Sochi. I was invited to participate in a conference in Sochi, because one of the second minister to be ordained, that was trained by Reverend Ron Rood from Izhevsk, elected to move to Sochi. So he started doing annual conferences there. And so I visited Sochi. And I'm at a loss for which year that was. About 6 years ago, I would say, 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
I had not seen my students there in 7 years when I was there. So this must have been 2009.
Okay.
I had not seen them in 7 years, and they were building Sochi up for the Olympics. I mean, all the highest buildings that were in Sochi weren't even there when I was there. It was an amazing transformation that I beheld. But what else was really touching for me was that Reverend Sasha Tenson, he was the minister that moved from Izhevsk down to Sochi to start work there, and he tapped on, he was, some of my old students came on board that could take practitioner courses, because they had taken 4 courses. And but when we had the conference there, he had many people come from Izhevsk that had already some years experience as Russian practitioners. And I had talked about practitioners to my students in Sochi, but they had never met a Russian-speaking practitioner. And here they had a number of them doing workshops and speaking at the conference there. And I can't tell you, I was overwhelmed with emotion to see my former Russian students meeting Russian practitioners for the first time and getting a real picture of what the potential was for them to continue the course of their study. It was a wonderful experience. That was 2001.
Who was the minister you mentioned? Who was the
his real name is Alexander Tensin, Tensin. However, Alexander, short for Alexander in Russia, is Sasha. So he is known as Reverend Sasha Tensin. And he's, now with sanctions against Russia and the incredible increase in the cost of travel in Russia, those conferences have been scaled down. He's not able to do those international conferences and invite Americans. They just can't put it together. And this is all, it's, I assume, due to sanctions and the economy being difficult in Russia, and travel costs have gone sky high. Because when I was at that conference, I saw faces of people from Izhevsk, from Kyiv, from all over in one place in Sochi, and they're really unable to duplicate that now with current travel expenses and the economy in Russia.
Well, for your information, Barbara Leger has continued to do conferences almost every year in
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine. And I've never attended, but I understand they're quite.
Yeah, I'm interested in doing that. Ukraine's travel expenses, the train travel, from my experience, last time I was there, travel in Ukraine was much more practical for local citizenry than it was in Russia. And so I could see how that, and Cherkasy is a wonderful place. I recommend. It's going through Kyiv and in Ukraine does not require a visa. It's a lot less complicated than going to Russia. So I recommend, if you want to have something like a Russian experience and you've never been there, Kyiv as the capital of Ukraine is very much a Russian type experience and immersion in that culture. And it's only a couple hours out of Kyiv to go to Cherkasy, if that's where, I'm sure that's where she's having her conferences. And so I highly recommend that experience to anybody who's remotely drawn to that.
That's very interesting to know that about the travel between Ukraine and the differences and Russia. But are you still in contact with any of your students from Russia?
I have been minimally. I'm trying to establish Facebook with some of my students and and be in touch with what's going on. I was trying to use Skype to call some of the old phone numbers I had, but just like in the United States, all those landlines are passé. They don't have those. I tried recently to try to call many of. Oh, I see my internet connection is across. Am I okay? You picking me up okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Throughout this whole interview, your physical presence has frozen at times, but then it picks up. So okay. The voice has stayed there all along. So do you have any additional or final things that you would like to say to whoever is watching this about Russia, Ukraine, and your experience there, and what you see for the future, perhaps, for that area?
Well, I have to tell you, what I haven't mentioned is that in that region of Izhevsk, there's so many licensed practitioners there, and many of them have branched out and to other cities where they're teaching accredited classes. So that whole region, it's mind-boggling to think how many people are impacted by what Reverend Ron Rood did there. His health had him have to move away to a drier region. He was in the Caucasus for a while, not that far from Sochi, but now I understand he's in America. And then, of course, that work in Izhevsk flowed out of the conference we did in St. Petersburg. So the ripple effect is just beyond comprehension for that region. And of course, Barbara Leger is having the same impact in Ukraine. And I see, I don't know what the numbers are now, but it's something that we all want to support what's going on over there. I think there's a lot of internal resources. I think Science of Mind has drawn people to a transformative teaching that has allowed them to transcend the conditions, the economies, the political systems. And that's what I said all along. It's like these principles are not these principles work. They're not contingent upon, what the economy is, what the political system is, and we have many marvelous people proving and demonstrating that in various places in Russia and in Ukraine. Heartening to know that many people have this to turn to when they're presented with the opportunity to check out our teaching. There are a substantial number of opportunities to Russians and Ukrainians to look into this and to study and be transformed and thrive in those countries. And other countries, because Ron Skeen traveled to Moldova and got a group going there, and that was the poorest country in Europe at the time, I believe. That's way over next to Bulgaria or something, Moldova, and you'll have to speak to somebody else about what might be going on in Latvia or Belarus. I guess I've run my course as far as what I have to share.
All right. Thank you very, very, very much for sharing with us, Robert. And you prefer to be called Travis. I'm sorry.
Travis, yes, that's right.
Yes. Well, thank you
or in
much.
Russian, Travis. Yes, signing off, I suppose. It's been a pleasure recalling these memories, and it's been a nice ride to go through these memories with you and share them with you.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Leo, founder of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. I hope you have enjoyed this wonderful interview with this very special, wise sage person. They've been around for quite a while. If you value these interviews, we invite you to show your generosity by making a donation or joining as a member of the Science of Mind Archives and Library Foundation. Thank you for watching.